The wind in that high valley had a voice, and it spoke of only one thing: endings. It was a whetted, cruel sound that scoured the dignity from the landscape, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of summer and the hard, unblinking promise of winter. Ilara Vance had come to know its every inflection. There was the low moan that signaled a coming frost, the sharp whistle that carried the first scent of snow, and the deep, guttural roar that was the blizzard itself, the final word in the valley's long, cold argument with life. She had been married to a man who heard music in that wind, but now, alone in the shell of the cabin he had started, all she heard was a threat. The cabin stood on a worthless shelf of land, a place the locals called the Widow's Perch, not out of sympathy but as a plain statement of fact. It was a place for endings. Her husband Daniel had bought the land for a song because it was worth less than the notes that comprised one. It was too high for reliable crops, too exposed for comfortable living, and too far from the town in the lower valley to be convenient for anything but solitude. He had seen a sanctuary. The world saw a mistake. He had managed to raise the four walls and lay the subfloor before a sudden fever, as swift and merciless as the valley's wind, had taken him. He left her with a half-finished dream, a stack of unpaid bills for lumber she couldn't afford, and the pity of a town that had always considered him a fool, and now considered her a tragedy bound to that same foolishness. The cabin was an open wound on the mountainside, and she was living inside it. Grief had been a physical weight in those first months, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the air from her lungs. It was a companion that shared her thin blanket at night and sat across from her at the makeshift table, a silent, ravenous guest. But as the autumn air grew teeth, a different feeling began to elbow grief aside, a cold, clear-eyed desperation. The temporary roof, a patchwork of tar paper and salvaged planks Daniel had thrown up just to keep the rain out, was already starting to argue with the wind. It fluttered and groaned, a constant, weary complaint that echoed the state of her own spirit. She knew with a certainty that was as solid as the granite bones of the mountain that it would not survive a single heavy snow. Survival had become a matter of engineering. The town below was a collection of sturdy, sensible structures, their roofs pitched at a sensible, traditional angle. They were built on the accumulated wisdom of generations who knew how to endure the valley's temper. The people there offered advice that felt more like judgment. Sell the land, they said. Come down from that forsaken perch before the snows trap you. Martha, who ran the general store, had been the kindest. There's no shame in it, Ilara. A woman alone has no business trying to tame that mountain. Her words, meant to soothe, felt like a branding iron, marking her as incapable, a problem to be solved by others. But selling meant surrendering the last tangible piece of Daniel, admitting that his dream was, and always had been, worthless. It meant admitting the wind had won. Her grief was still too raw for that, and a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed was beginning to calcify around it. The official notice came in the form of Mr. Thorne, the county building inspector. He was a man built of straight lines and right angles, with a face that seemed perpetually displeased by the world's chaotic curves. He drove his truck up the rutted track to her cabin, the engine complaining every foot of the way, and stood with his hands on his hips, his clipboard a shield of authority. He surveyed the unfinished structure with a look of profound disgust, as if the cabin had personally offended him. He didn't need to consult his papers. "This is a violation, Mrs. Vance," he stated, his voice as flat as the plains beyond the mountains. "An unpermitted, unfinished, and frankly unsafe dwelling. The county can't abide it." He tapped a finger on the flimsy roof. "That thing will collapse under the first serious load. It'll be a pancake by Christmas." He gave her the ultimatum with a kind of grim satisfaction. She had until the first official snowstorm, the one that closed the pass, to either bring the structure up to code or demolish it. Failure to comply would result in fines she could never pay, and the county tearing it down at her expense, putting a lien on the one thing she owned. Bringing it to code, he clarified, means a proper load-bearing roof. Trusses, sheathing, shingles, the works. You'd need a crew, you'd need money. He did not need to add the final unspoken words, which you don't have. He was condemning her not just from the cabin, but from the mountain, from the last echo of her life with Daniel. He was the voice of the world telling her she had failed. He saw a liability, a problem to be erased from the hillside. As his truck rumbled back down the mountain, leaving a cloud of dust and finality in its wake, Alara felt a strange calm settle over her. The desperation was still there, a cold stone in her stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was focusing. Thorn had given her a deadline, an enemy with a face. He had, in his own cruel way, given her a purpose beyond just surviving the days. She looked at the cabin not as a monument to her loss, but as a fortress she had to defend. She had no money for a crew, no resources for a conventional roof. The world's solutions were unavailable to her. Therefore, she would have to find a solution the world had overlooked. For days, she did nothing but watch. She abandoned the pretense of chores and simply observed the way her small world worked. She walked the high ridges, her eyes not on the spectacular vistas, but on the minutiae of survival around her. She studied the ancient pines that clung to the wind-blasted cliffs. She saw how their branches, thick and resilient near the trunk, grew progressively more flexible toward the tips. They didn't fight the snow's weight. They yielded to it, letting it slide off, shedding the load before it could become a breaking strain. She ran her hands over the bark of a great fir, noticing its texture, the deep furrows and ridges, the way the outer layers were rough and sacrificial, protecting the living wood beneath. It was a shield built of layers, with tiny pockets of air trapped between them. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell, tales from a homeland buried under snow for half the year. Her grandmother spoke of houses built with the wisdom of the forest, of attics so cold you could store meat in them all winter, a buffer of frigid air that kept the house warm and the roof free of ice. The snow is a blanket, her grandmother had said, but the ice is a hammer. You must never let the hammer form. Ice dams, Alara knew, were the true killers of roofs. They formed when heat escaping from the house melted the bottom layer of snow, which then refroze at the eaves, creating a dam that trapped meltwater, forcing it back up under the shingles where it would rot and weaken the structure from within. One afternoon, sitting on a cold rock, she pieced it all together: the yielding branches of the pine, the layered insulating bark of the fir, her grandmother's cold attic. The world's solution was a single strong roof, a brute force approach to fighting the weight of the snow. It was an act of defiance, but defiance required resources she did not have. Nature's solution was different. It was not about defiance. It was about accommodation. It was about layers. It was about space. The idea that bloomed in her mind was so contrary to every sensible roof she had ever seen that she almost laughed at its audacity. She would not build one roof. She would build two. The plan was simple in concept and maddeningly complex in execution. She would first build a steep, sharply pitched inner roof directly over the cabin's walls. Its only purpose was to shed snow as quickly as possible, like the flexible branches of the pine. It didn't need to be perfectly weatherproof, just slick and angled. Above that, supported by a separate, taller frame, she would build a second, outer roof. This one would be less steep, more conventional in its slope. It would bear the initial brunt of the snowfall, holding the bulk of the weight. Between the two roofs would be a significant air gap, a 3-foot void of open space. This was the heart of the idea. This was the cold attic, the space between the layers of bark. This was the innovation born of desperation. The air in that gap, she reasoned, would remain at the same temperature as the outside air. It would be a thermal break, a buffer zone that would prevent any heat from the cabin below from reaching the snow on the outer roof. There would be no melting and therefore no ice dams. The snow would remain a dry, light powder, a blanket, not a hammer. The steep inner roof would shed any snow that managed to filter through, funneling it down and out through vents she would build into the eaves of the outer structure. From the outside, it would look bizarre, like a house wearing a hat that was too big for it. It would look, to a man like Thorne, like madness. She smiled. It was the only plan she had. It was a roof built not of money but of observation. The work was a brutal catechism of pain. Every morning she rose before the sun, her body a geography of aches from the day before. Her hands, soft from a life spent indoors, became calloused, then blistered, then calloused again over the raw skin. She learned the heft of a hammer, the bite of a saw, the stubborn resistance of a 10-penny nail driven into old, hard wood. She scavenged. She dismantled the half-rotted fence Daniel had put up, prying the nails out one by one, straightening them on a flat stone. She tore down a collapsed shed at the edge of the property, salvaging every usable plank. Each piece of wood was a small victory, a resource wrested from decay. She started with the inner roof. Creating the steep pitch was a nightmare of geometry and brute force. Working alone, she devised a clumsy system of levers and props to hoist the long ridge beam into place. More than once, a plank slipped, crashing to the floor just inches from where she stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was haunted by the thought of a fall, of lying injured and alone with no one to hear her calls but the wind. But the fear only sharpened her focus. She moved with a deliberate, methodical slowness, checking every knot, testing every foothold. Slowly, agonizingly, the skeleton of the first roof took shape, its sharp, improbable angle pointing at the gray sky like an accusation. It was during this phase that Silas began to watch her. He was a man of the mountain, lean and weathered, who made his living trapping and guiding. He lived a few miles down the ridge, in a cabin that was as practical and unadorned as he was. He would appear at the tree line, silent as a shadow, and just stand there, watching her work. At first, she found his presence unnerving, another pair of judging eyes. But his gaze wasn't mocking. It was perplexed. One day, he emerged from the trees and walked over, stopping a respectful distance away. He held out a whetstone. "Your saw is dull," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're fighting the wood more than you're cutting it." She accepted it, her pride warring with her exhaustion, while he expertly sharpened the blade, bringing its teeth to a silver gleam. He looked up at the strange, steep structure she was building. "That's a mighty sharp pitch, ma'am," he observed. "Snow'll come off that like a gunshot." She nodded, not offering any more information. He didn't press. He finished his work, handed the saw back to her, and left as quietly as he had come. He returned a few days later with a coil of good rope. "Might help with the lifting," was all he said. He never offered to help directly, respecting the fierce, solitary bubble of her labor, but his small contributions were a lifeline. Yet the skepticism was always there, a quiet hum beneath his kindness. When she began constructing the second outer framework, his perplexity deepened. He watched her build the taller support posts, anchor them to the extended foundation Daniel had poured, and begin the arduous process of raising the second set of rafters. He finally broke his silence on it one afternoon. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Vance," he started, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion, "but it seems to me you're building a roof for your roof." I am, she said simply, not stopping her work. He shook his head slowly, a sad, pitying gesture. That's twice the lumber, twice the work, twice the nails, all for one cabin. He looked at her blistered hands, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. The valley folk, they're starting to talk. They're calling it Ilara's folly. Let them, she replied, her voice flat. She drove a nail home with 3 sharp, clean blows. The sound was a full stop to the conversation. Silas said no more, but the pity in his eyes was now mingled with a reluctant sort of awe at her sheer, stubborn determination. He didn't understand her purpose, but he could not deny her industry. He was her only ally, and even he thought she was mad. The community's whispers soon found a voice in Mr. Thorne. He made another official visit, timing it for a day when the wind was particularly cruel, as if to underscore his point. He found her wrestling a long rafter for the outer roof into place. He didn't even get out of his truck, just rolled down the window and shouted over the engine's idle. What in God's name is that monstrosity, Mrs. Vance? His face was a mask of incredulous anger. To him, this wasn't just foolishness. It was a flagrant rejection of his authority, a deliberate mockery of the building code he held so sacred. She ignored him, focusing on seating the rafter. He killed the engine and got out, stalking toward her. I gave you clear instructions. A proper load-bearing roof. Not this woodshed built on top of a house. This is a joke. Ilara finally looked at him, her eyes cold. It will be 2 load-bearing roofs, Mr. Thorne, one to shed the snow and one to hold it, with a thermal break in between. He stared at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. He blinked, then let out a short, barking laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. A thermal break? Ma'am, you're building a fire hazard and a wind trap. The first big gust that gets under that top layer is going to peel it off and send it halfway to the next county. And what it doesn't blow away, the snow will crush. This is the single most idiotic piece of homespun engineering I have ever seen. He shook his head, his official capacity giving way to pure derision. You're a bigger fool than your husband was. Tear it down, tear it all down and start over properly. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mountain itself. Thorne's face darkened. I'm posting the final condemnation notice. The moment the pass is closed by snow, this property is forfeit. I'll see to it personally. He stormed back to his truck, leaving her alone with the wind, her half-finished folly, and the rapidly approaching deadline. The confrontation, instead of breaking her, hardened her resolve into something akin to steel. His mockery was fuel, the town's laughter was a whetstone. She worked with a feverish intensity, racing the coming winter. She sheathed the inner roof with salvaged tin that would be ice slick. She covered the outer roof with thick planking, overlapping them meticulously. She was no longer just building a shelter. She was preparing for a battle, and her strange, double-roofed cabin was her shield. The first snows were a gentle warning, a dusting of white that outlined the world in silver. They melted by midday, but they were a promise. The sky grew heavy, the color of old pewter, and the air became still and cold, holding its breath. The valley people finished their winter preparations, casting anxious glances up at the widow's perch, where Ilara's bizarre structure stood silhouetted against the bruised sky. The talk in the general store was a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were all waiting for the folly to fail. Then it came. It did not start as a storm, but as a slow, silent descent of impossibly large flakes. They drifted down, thick and lazy, covering everything in a blanket of profound silence. For a full day, it snowed like this, a soft, deceptive accumulation. The valley children laughed and played in it. But Ilara, watching from her small window, felt a knot of dread and anticipation tighten in her stomach. This was the opening act. The real performance was yet to come. On the second night, the wind rose. The gentle snowfall turned into a furious horizontal assault. The blizzard that the old-timers would later call the White Death descended upon the valley. It was a living thing, a ravenous beast of wind and ice. The world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The sound was immense, a deafening roar that vibrated through the very timbers of the cabin. Alara sat by her small wood stove, the only source of warmth and light, and listened to the battle being waged just a few feet above her head. The outer roof took the full concussive force of the wind. The entire structure shuddered with each powerful gust. She could hear the snow, not soft but sharp and granular, scouring the planks like sand. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. A wind trap. She held her breath, waiting for the catastrophic sound of splintering wood, for the roof to be torn away into the white chaos. But the frame held. Daniel had built the foundation well, and she had anchored her creation to it with desperate strength. The outer roof groaned and flexed, but it held its ground. Hours turned into a day, then two. The storm was relentless. The snow began to pile up, a weight that was terrifying in its sheer immensity. She could no longer see out of her windows. The cabin was entombed. The only connection to the outside world was the sound. And now a new sound began. It was a low, intermittent rumble from above, followed by a soft, percussive whoosh. It was the sound of her system working. Small avalanches of snow, having accumulated on the outer roof, were slumping and sliding. The weight was immense, but it was a dry, manageable weight. Inside the air gap, the magic was happening. The frigid air acted as a perfect insulator. No heat from her stove reached the outer roof. No ice dams were forming at the eaves. The snow remained a powder, unable to bind itself into the heavy, waterlogged slab that was death to a roof. Some of it filtered through the gaps in the outer planks, falling onto the steep, tin-sheathed inner roof. From there, it slid instantly downwards, a tiny, harmless cascade, and was harmlessly ejected through the vents she had built. She was living inside a theory, and the theory was holding true. Down in the valley, the story was different. The snow was heavier there, wetter. It clung to the sensible traditional roofs, and it did not let go. The heat from the houses melted the bottom layer, and the water, trapped by the massive accumulation, refroze into thick, heavy dams of solid ice. The weight became astronomical. First there were groans, then the sickening crack of rafters giving way. All through the town the sounds of collapse began to echo through the storm. The roof of the general store, the pride of the town, was the first to go, caving in with a roar that was heard even over the wind. Then another and another. Families huddled in the strongest corners of their homes, listening to their ceilings sag and their walls splinter. Silas was in his cabin, listening to the ominous creaks of his own sturdy roof. He had built it himself to the exact specifications of his father and grandfather before him. It had never failed. But this storm was different. The weight was obscene. A fine shower of dust and splinters began to drift down from the ceiling joists. He saw a crack appear in the main ridge beam, a dark line that grew with every gust of wind. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood wood, that it was only a matter of time, and in that moment of terror, his thoughts went to the woman up on the ridge, to her folly. He imagined her buried, crushed under the weight of her two foolish roofs. A pang of guilt struck him. He had watched her work herself to the bone and had done nothing but offer pity. The crack in his beam widened with a sound like a pistol shot. That was enough. Grabbing his heaviest coat and his snowshoes, he made a decision born of desperation and a sudden, inexplicable need to know. He had to see. He plunged into the white fury of the storm. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, and the snow was so deep it was like wading through sand. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the slope beneath his feet. He expected to arrive at a flattened pile of lumber. He expected to find nothing but a tomb of snow. When he finally stumbled into her clearing, he couldn't believe his eyes. The cabin was almost completely buried, a mere mound in the white landscape. But it was standing. A plume of smoke rose calmly from its stone chimney, a defiant gray flag against the churning white of the storm. The top of the bizarre double roof was visible, heaped with a mountain of snow, but it was not sagging. It was not broken. It looked serene. He staggered to the door, his beard frozen solid, and pounded on it with a numb fist. The door opened, and Alara stood there, bathed in the warm orange light of her lamp. She was holding a cup of tea. She looked calm, safe. She saw the state he was in, the frozen terror in his eyes, and simply stepped aside. "Come in, Silas, it's cold out." He stumbled inside, his snowshoes clattering on the floorboards. The warmth was a shock to his system. He looked up. The ceiling was solid, dry. There were no creaks, no groans, no fine dust of splintering wood. There was only the muffled roar of the storm outside and the quiet crackle of the fire in the stove. He stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the calm inside the cabin with the violent destruction he had just fled. "My roof," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "It's coming down. The whole town. The roofs are collapsing." He looked around the small, secure space, then back at her face. The pity was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked awe. He finally asked the question that had driven him through the blizzard. "How? Your roof? It has twice the weight. It should have been the first to go. How is it standing?" Alara didn't offer a long explanation. She didn't need to. She just took a sip of her tea and pointed a single finger toward the ceiling. "Space," she said. The answer was empty space. In that moment, he understood. He didn't grasp the physics of it, not fully, but he understood the fundamental truth. He had witnessed a miracle of engineering born not in a workshop or a university, but on a desolate mountainside by a lone woman with nothing but her hands and her mind. He sank onto a stool, the adrenaline leaving him, and just shook his head. "I'll be damned," he whispered into the warm, safe air. We all called it a folly. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. When the sun emerged, it was to a world transformed, buried, and broken. The valley below was a scene of devastation. Nearly a third of the homes had suffered catastrophic roof collapses. The rest were heavily damaged. The snow was piled 20 feet deep in the drifts. It took days for people to dig themselves out, to check on their neighbors, to fully comprehend the scale of the disaster. The first thing they saw, once the air was clear, was the plume of smoke rising from the widow's perch. It was impossible. Slowly, as the townspeople began the arduous process of recovery, the story Silas told began to spread. It started as a rumor, an unbelievable tale of the madwoman's cabin surviving the storm that had broken them all. It was met with disbelief, then curiosity. Men, their own homes in ruins, began the long, arduous trek up the mountain. They came not to mock or pity, but to see. They stood in the clearing, their faces grim, and stared at Alara's folly. They saw the mountain of snow still piled on the outer roof, a weight that should have crushed it like an eggshell. And they saw that it was standing. Mr. Thorne was among them. His own house had suffered a partial collapse, a fact that was a deep personal humiliation. He trudged up the hill, his face a thundercloud of denial. He walked around the structure, poking at the snow, examining the posts, searching for the flaw, the trick, the reason his judgment had been so spectacularly wrong. He found none. He found only a design that had worked perfectly when every one of his approved two-code designs had failed. Alara watched him from her window, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, weary vindication. He eventually left without a word, his authority shattered, his certainty turned to dust. The perception of Alara Vance shifted not overnight, but with the slow, powerful certainty of a glacier. The name Alara's Folly died on their lips, replaced by a new one, the Hollow Ridge Roof, or more simply, the Vance Method. The woman they had dismissed as a grieving, foolish widow was suddenly seen as something else entirely. A visionary, an innovator, a survivor. The mockery turned to respect, the pity to awe. In the spring, when the great melt began and the true work of rebuilding started, they did not consult architects from the city or dusty books of plans. They came to her. They came in ones and twos at first, hats in their hands, their faces etched with newfound humility. They asked her questions. They wanted to understand the principle of the air gap, the steep pitch of the inner roof, the venting system. She explained it patiently without condescension, sketching the design in the dirt with a stick. She spoke of the pine trees and the layered bark, of working with the snow instead of fighting it. She was no longer the outsider on the mountain. She had become its oracle. Silas was her first and most fervent disciple, helping translate her ideas into practical terms for the other men, his voice filled with the conviction of a witness. That summer, a strange and wonderful new architecture began to rise from the ruins of the old valley. A new generation of houses was built, and every single one of them featured a distinctive high-profile double roof. They were more work to build, they required more lumber, but they were built with the hard-won wisdom of a terrible winter. They were a testament to a shared disaster and a shared salvation. Alara never asked for payment for her design, but she never wanted for anything again. A cord of firewood would appear on her porch, a basket of winter vegetables from a root cellar, a new sharp axe head left silently by her door. It was the currency of respect, a currency she had earned with blistered hands and an idea that everyone else had laughed at. Decades passed. The valley thrived, its people secure in their strange-looking, utterly safe homes. The Vance Method became a regional signature, a point of pride, a story told to children about the great storm and the wise woman on the mountain. Alara lived out her days on the widow's perch, which was no longer a place of endings but a place of beginning. She was never lonely. The cabin that was once a symbol of her grief became a landmark, and she its quiet, dignified keeper. She had not set out to change a community or invent a new way of building. She had only set out to survive, but in her quiet, desperate struggle, she had done so much more. The story serves as a profound reminder that the most revolutionary ideas are often born not in abundance, but in scarcity. It is in the space of having nothing that we are forced to see everything differently. The world often mocks what it does not understand, mistaking the unconventional for the foolish. It champions brute strength and overlooks the subtle power of accommodation, the resilience of yielding, the profound strength that can be found in empty space. True wisdom rarely shouts. It whispers in the patterns of the natural world, in the remembered words of an ancestor, in the quiet observations of a desperate mind. It is a lesson etched into the very architecture of that high mountain valley. What one generation calls folly, the next may call its foundation.